Thank you, Madam Chair, Excellencies, honourable members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. The proposal of the European Commission for a mandate to begin negotiations with the ACP Group of States, published on December the 12th last year, 2007, is more ambitious than many sceptics had feared. It is better in form, in language and in content, but it leaves also room for improvement and an enormous need to strengthen strategic focus, public meaning and political ambition. It speaks of common interests and outlines shared values. As good as this is, such enumerations always tend to be broad shopping lists. They remain vague on inherent conflict of aims and subsequent problems of implementation. Honesty about obstacles is very often mentioned in this proposal, but there is also a permanent danger, almost running through the text, of duplications. Let me take the liberty to address three key aspects which needs deepening in the subsequent discussions also of your distinguished Committee on Development. First, branding. The Commission proposal recognizes the essential importance of a legally binding agreement. The objectives shall be, as the proposal states, and I quote, a new agreement that consists of 3 regional compacts based on a common foundation. The tailor-made suggestions for a regional compact with Africa, a regional compact with the Caribbean, and a regional compact with the Pacific are sort of reasonably specific, sometimes even overly specific. Rightly so, I tend to believe the Commission proposal is not overstretching the EU by enlarging a future treaty to Latin America and North Africa. But some creativity is necessary to reach out to the regional groupings representing those 2 regions. Why not, for instance, in form of additional EU tailor-made regional compacts? Above all, however, the idea of the overall so-called common foundation remains somewhat vague in terms of its substance and meaning. Ad hoc summits of heads of state are probably not good enough to really contribute to a substantial innovation in global governance. If done well, and that is probably better than what has been outlined so far, this overall common foundation could serve as a substantial innovation in global governance, but further work, seems to me, has to be done. In earlier writings, I have proposed an EU-ACP association treaty following the Cotonou Agreement, and I'm sure that your distinguished Committee on Development will generate and advocate an even more powerful idea, hopefully without again resorting to the language of obscure processes with reference to the name of contingent cities, to give this really a proper political brand name. Second, geopolitics. The proposal of the Commission begins right away by identifying the objective of the new treaty as, and I quote again, forging a political partnership focused on building peaceful, stable, well-governed, prosperous and resilient states and societies. This is all certainly true, but tends to look only at the ACP side of the partnership, or is it also about us EU member states when we hear the wording of prosperous, resilient states and societies? The new treaty will only gain support across the EU if its objectives come across as being both in the interest of the ACP partner regions and in the self-interest of the EU and its citizens. The geopolitical meaning of a renewed partnership is without doubt of mutual relevance. Taken together, as we all know, the soon-to-be 27 EU member states and 79, maybe 80, should Cuba join, ACP countries constitute more than 50% of the 193 UN member states. The future partnership must translate into a more visible strategic presence in the United Nations system to fulfill its purpose. Would it, for instance, make sense to install an EU-ACP coordination unit in the premises of the EU delegations at the United Nations? The EU will certainly, in this context, have to accept the desire of ACP countries to engage with other partners worldwide, independent from EU relations with the EU. In support of this legitimate interest of each of the ACP regions and the regional groupings in all these regions of the Global South, the EU could in my humble view, advocate an enhanced observer status in the United Nations for the leading regional groupings in the different ACP regions, just along the line of the upgraded EU observer status. More than ever, global order depends on reliable pillars of stability, as we all know. This requires actors that can predictably generate norms and project leadership. A new ACP-EU treaty can set an example of this nature. While the UN Sustainable Development Goals are not free from contradictions and conflicting aims and lack implementation mechanisms, the new treaty could become a strong, multilateral and maybe even the single most relevant effort to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals based on a legally binding commitment by states across 4 continents. This in itself would be an enormous contribution to multilateral global order. And success in this important area might also be a way forward to help maintaining ACP cohesion. Jointly promoting a UN Global Migration Convention could be another very important issue of common interest on the global level. Third point, Brexit. The Commission proposal does not address in any way the possible deconstructing effect of Brexit on long-term cohesion of the ACP group of states and also of the reactions within the EU. One question obviously seems to loom large, to be very undiplomatically frank. May Africa, in the end of the day, favour the EU-AU relation over the ACP concept? Question mark. As usual, and I refer to Brexit again, the smallest countries and the most remote regions are potentially suffering the most. The very first SOS email I received the morning after the Brexit referendum came from Fiji. What could happen to stability in Fiji? It asked if tariffs or quota will be imposed on future Fiji sugar exports via the UK to EU27. How will those, generally speaking, how will those ACP countries organise their future who are also member of the Commonwealth? Is the EPA story finally dead, while Commonwealth countries have more leverage to not ratify what they may have signed anyway, more out of fear than out of faith? What does the EU27 offer to reluctant partners in the context of the fallout of Brexit? And often forgotten, what is the effect of Brexit on the European overseas countries and territories and their respective region? 12 of the 25 OCTs will be leaving the association with the EU when Brexit takes place. The strategically most important British OCTs are located in the Indian Ocean, in the South Atlantic and in Antarctica. Among them, for instance, are the Falkland Islands, worried about future access for fish to the EU, but also of growing importance as gateway to Antarctica and its frontiers in climate matters and long-term geopolitics. A global Europe needs to address these questions also in the context of the ACP discussion. The biggest number, however, is located of OCTs, is located in the Caribbean, where Brexit has already unraveling aspects for CARICOM cohesion. The Brexit vote, for instance, has strengthened, if I'm not mistaken, reluctant integrationists who are afraid, like in Jamaica, that their country could lose its global trade potential. They favour, as we hear, leaving CARICOM and its common market as a consequence of Brexit, as an indirect consequence of Brexit. No other ACP region includes so many EU overseas territories and, of course, ACP countries as the Caribbean does, who are affected directly by Brexit. Will Brexit, generally speaking, even bring new constellations forward for the whole OCT concept and beyond the ACP agenda? Will there be space for reciprocity, let's say through joint research financing for ACP countries with the Commonwealth and for British OCTs with the EU in terms of research funding, for instance? In any case, the effect of Brexit, it seems to me, on the OCT question, and this is why I addressed it, makes, in my humble view, the merger of the European Development Fund with the general EU budget even more reasonable. It adds another argument to the argumentation of the European Parliament. But will all 27 EU member states really be ready this time and united in embracing the long overdue budget Europeanization? Question mark. Brexit, in any case, I think certainly requires a more coherent global Europe. The new ACP-EU treaty, ladies and gentlemen, will always be in danger to elaborate on too many aspects and too many topics, mostly unavoidable, it seems. Even more so, however, it is vital that key priorities must be defined as precise as possible. Let me just, at the end of my presentation, run through them as brief as I can. Development aid. The challenge for the EU and its ACP partners, no matter the final construction of this relationship, the challenge will be to add new value and meaning to the very notion of development. All countries on earth, including ASEAN Europe, are developing countries in a way. And aid, in my humble view, is a global contribution to welfare, but not the driver of development. No development regionalism or national indicative programme anywhere will work without a proper understanding and sector-specific implementation of enforceable regulatory mechanisms of governance. This includes the establishment of independent antitrust policies and agencies, control mechanisms to prevent excessive use of public subsidies, and so on. The proposal mentions some of these issues, including the complex agenda of land and property rights. It also mentions, but only in passing, the potential of the EU external investment plan, but that could be strengthened maybe, this whole focus. Second point, trade. More than during the time of the EPA negotiations, which I hope definitely will be left behind the EU and the ACP in the course of all these negotiations, the EU must bring forward convincing arguments why rule-based trade and investment protection is of the essence for all. Moreover, I cannot but agree with ACP's General Secretary P.I. Gomez, and I quote him, "Throughout the past EPA negotiations, the EU side failed to articulate an understanding of trade as an instrument of development." End of quote. This is especially true for smaller and poorer ACP states. And in response to the return of power politics and the fascination with big emerging markets, the EU and the ACP group of states need to make better use of tripartite trade and investment cooperation with any third country interested to contribute to the objectives outlined in this new partnership proposition. That EU-ACP trade flow has more than doubled since 2000 to 5% of EU exports and 5.4% of EU imports should be an incentive to become as creative as possible in this respect, without any sense of defeatism, especially when it always comes to the endless debates about China in the global south. Private sector capital definitely, it seems to me, is a key central element and not just complementary, as the Commission proposal suggests on page 42. Third and last point, political dialogue. The term is as broad as it is inconclusive. Oh, I'm sorry. The EU would be advised to do the utmost to overcome the traditional criticism of lecturing the ACP by looking kind of down with a grain of suspicion. Why can the EU not make better use of reciprocal activities in the field of political dialogue, for instance, by issuing an invitation to monitor the elections to the European Parliament by ACP observers? The Commission proposal mentions, although rather unspecific, the need to monitor the implementation of a future treaty. To avoid that evaluation and impact assessment will merely generate yet another industry of outsourced technocratic activities decoupled from the overall societies both in the EU and in the ACP, parliamentary oversight is certainly necessary. The EU-ACP relationship needs to be broader in the political sphere, and it also needs to be more solid through new forms of reaching out to civil society beyond traditional advocacy groups and stakeholders, on the level of each regional compact and also on the overall ACP level, although this poses the dilemma of the danger of duplication or the danger of lack of legally binding structures for all. I'm sure this is going to be discussed in your committee as well. I could imagine on the political as well on the civil society aspect constructions like let's say EU-ACP Home Affairs Committee a migration forum, a business forum, a security studies network, or a maritime forum, to name just the most obvious. I thank you for your patience by summing up the privilege given to me in addressing this distinguished committee. The EU, with 77.3% of the global population, accounting for 25% of world's GDP and contributing 35% of global trade, and the ACP group of states with 14% of global population, accounting for 1.9% of the world's GDP and contributing 4.7% of global trade, surely represent diverse and asymmetric realities. But the European Parliament's voice will be very vital in the months ahead to promote and advance this relationship between the European Union and the African, Caribbean and Pacific partners as what they are, without any doubt, a very important aspect of the growing global role of Europe and a test case for multilateralism in these uncertain times. Thank you for your patience.